In a small kitchen at the end of Sycamore Lane, there's an old radio that has not been switched off, not fully, not once, in the 3 years since a woman named Helen died. It plays low all day and all night. The morning news she used to half listen to, the afternoon programs, the old songs after dark. And the man who keeps it playing is her husband, Roy, who is 79 years old and has told no one the real reason he cannot bear to turn it off. His daughter thinks he simply likes the company of a little noise. The neighbors, if they think of it at all, think nothing of it. But there is a reason that radio never goes quiet, and it goes all the way back to a single terrible morning 3 years ago, and to the one sound Roy cannot stand to hear in that house ever again, which is no sound at all. Tonight, with the summer dark coming down soft over the lane, his daughter is finally going to ask him why, and his answer is going to change the way she hears silence for the rest of her life. Welcome to the Lamplit Hour, where every story is a small light left on for someone who needs it. If stories like this bring you comfort, take a moment to subscribe and stay a while. So let the summer evening settle over the little house and let the radio play on low the way it always does now, and let us sit a while at Roy's kitchen table. Let me tell you about Roy and Helen and the sound they made together for 50 years. He had met her at a dance, of course. Where else would a man meet a woman like Helen? A woman made of music, but at a dance. Roy had been a quiet young man, awkward at parties, the kind who stood by the wall and watched. And Helen had been the girl in the middle of the room who could not stand still when there was a band playing. She had come over to him that first night because he was not dancing, and she had decided, with the cheerful certainty that would define the next 50 years, that this would not do. She had taken his hand and pulled him onto the floor and laughed at his stiffness and taught him over the course of one evening and then a lifetime how to move to music. He never got good at it. He would tell you that himself. But she never cared whether he was good at it. She only cared that he would get up and do it with her, and for 50 years he did, at weddings and in the kitchen, and once, memorably, in the aisle of a grocery store when a song they loved came on over the speakers and Helen simply could not let it pass. That was the woman he married, a woman who heard music everywhere and could not let it pass without dancing, and that, in the end, is why the silence was so unbearable when she was gone, because a house that had held a woman like that and then held her no longer did not just become quiet. It became the exact and total opposite of everything she had been. Roy and Helen Abbott had lived in that house on Sycamore Lane for the better part of half a century, and for all of those years, the kitchen had been the loud, warm heart of it. Not loud in a bad way, loud in the way a house is loud when it is full of a life being lived. Helen was a woman who could not be silent and did not want to be. She sang while she cooked, hymns and old radio tunes, and songs she half remembered and made up the rest of. She talked to the radio as though it could hear her, arguing with the news, laughing at the programs, humming along to the music. She talked to Roy, and to the cat, and to the pot on the stove, and to herself, a running, warm murmur of a woman who filled every room she was in with sound, the way some people fill a room with light. For 50 years, Roy had come down every morning to a kitchen that was already awake, the radio on, the kettle going, Helen singing at the counter with her back to him, and the whole house alive with the ordinary music of her being in it. There was a particular ritual to it on Sunday evenings that Roy would remember to the end of his days. The old station ran a request hour after supper, the kind of program that has all but vanished from the world now. A warm-voiced host reading out dedications sent in by listeners, playing the old songs. This one goes out to Marjorie on her 70th birthday from all who love her. That sort of thing. Helen had loved that hour. She had loved it for 50 years. And every so often, on their anniversary, Roy would do the one romantic thing he ever reliably managed to do. He would call the station on the Friday before, shy and gruff, and ask them to play their song on the Sunday show and dedicate it to Helen from Roy with love. And Helen would be at the sink washing up after supper, and the host would read it out. And this one's for Helen on Sycamore Lane from her husband Roy, 50 years and counting. And Helen would go still and turn around with her hands still wet and soapy and look at him across the kitchen with an expression he did not have words for and did not need words for, and they would dance. Right there on the worn linoleum, an old man and an old woman, slow, not very well, to a song on the radio while the supper dishes dried in the rack. 50 years of Sunday evenings. Roy had thought there would always be one more. He had not known in all those 50 years that this was the thing he loved most. You never do. You think you love the big things, the milestones and the holidays and the grand declarations, and then the person is gone and you find out that what you actually loved, what you cannot live without, what wakes you at 3 a.m. with an ache you cannot name, is the sound of them humming in the next room, the small daily music of another person sharing your life. Roy would have told you if you had asked him at 75 that he loved his wife. He would not have known to tell you that what he loved was the noise she made. He only learned that on the morning it stopped. If this story is finding its way to you, a quiet like helps me keep the lamp lit for others. Helen died on an ordinary Tuesday morning in the spring, quietly, of a stroke, in her sleep beside him. She did not wake, and Roy woke, as he always did, a little before her, and he lay there for a moment in the gray early light, the way he always did, waiting to hear her stir. And she did not stir, and the house was quiet. That was the first thing he noticed before he understood anything else. The quiet, because Helen had not gotten up to put the radio on. In 50 years, Helen had always been the first one up, and the radio had always been playing by the time Roy came down, and on that one morning it was not. And the house was silent in a way it had simply never been silent before in all the years they had lived in it. Roy lay there in that unfamiliar silence, and some animal part of him knew, before his mind would let him know it, that something was terribly wrong, because the house was quiet, and the house was never quiet, and the only thing that had ever made it quiet was here, beside him, not stirring. He does not remember much of the hours after, the ambulance, the neighbors, the daughter driving through the night from 2 states away. But he remembers the silence. He remembers standing in his own kitchen that afternoon, after they had taken her away, and hearing nothing at all, no singing, no kettle, no radio, no running warm murmur of the woman who had filled that house with sound for 50 years, and feeling that the silence was not just the absence of noise, it was the sound of her being gone. It was grief made audible, or rather made into the absence of audible things, a roaring, terrible quiet that filled the whole house and pressed on his chest and told him over and over with every silent second, "She is not here, she is not here, she is not here." He turned the radio on that afternoon. He does not fully remember deciding to. He just could not stand the quiet for one more minute, and so he reached over and switched on the little radio that had sat on the kitchen windowsill for 40 years, the one Helen had always turned on first thing, and it came to life with some ordinary afternoon program, some voices talking about ordinary things, and the sound filled the kitchen. And Roy stood there and wept, because for just a moment, just one moment, the house sounded alive again. It sounded the way it had sounded every morning of his married life. And he understood, standing there, that he was not going to be able to turn it off. Not that night, not the next day. Not, as it turned out, for 3 years and counting. Because here was the truth that Roy could not explain to his daughter, could not explain to anyone, could barely explain to himself. The radio was not about the radio. He did not care what was on it. Half the time, he did not even hear it. It could be the news or a ball game or static. It did not matter. What mattered was that the house was not silent. What mattered was that when he came down the stairs in the morning, into the kitchen, where Helen was not standing at the counter singing, there was at least sound in the room, some human voice, some music, some evidence that the world was still turning, and the house was still a place where life happened. The radio was a small, brave lie. He told himself every single day. It let him come down to the kitchen without walking into a tomb. It let him make his coffee to the sound of voices the way he had for 50 years, even if the voices were strangers on the radio and not his wife singing hymns off-key. It kept the silence, the terrible silence of that first morning, the silence that meant she was gone from ever filling the house again. So it played all day, all night, low, always low, a murmur in the background of an old man's grief. He turned it down at night, but never off, because he had learned that if he woke at 3 in the morning to true silence, the grief came back as fresh and total as that first Tuesday, and he could not survive that every night. But if there was sound, even the faint murmur of an overnight program drifting up the stairs, then the house was still alive, and he could turn over and go back to sleep and make it to morning. The radio got him through the nights. It got him through 3 years of nights, and no one knew, because how do you explain a thing like that? How do you tell your practical daughter that you keep a radio on 24 hours a day because silence sounds like your wife being dead? The first year had been the hardest, the way the first year always is. Roy had moved through it like a man underwater, doing the things a widower does, learning the terrible small skills of the newly alone. How to cook for one, how to sleep in the middle of a bed that had held 2 people for 50 years, how to fill the long, shapeless hours that Helen used to fill simply by being in them. He learned that grief is not one big wave that knocks you down and is gone. It is 1,000 small ambushes. It is reaching for 2 coffee cups out of habit and having to put one back. It is hearing a joke on the radio and turning to tell her and finding no one there. It is the way the house held her everywhere and nowhere at once. Her coat still on the hook, her reading glasses still on the windowsill, her handwriting on the calendar in the months she did not live to see. And through all of it, under all of it, the radio played, the one thing that stayed constant, the one sound that kept the house from becoming the tomb it threatened every silent moment to become. Roy did not think of the radio as company exactly. Helen had been company. The radio was something else, a kind of medicine, a thing he took so he could keep breathing in a house that had lost its voice. There were Sunday evenings in those 3 years when the request hour came on and Roy would sit at the kitchen table where they used to dance and listen to the warm-voiced host read out other people's dedications, other people's Marjorie's and anniversaries and birthdays. And he would think about calling in. He never did. He could not have gotten the words out, but he listened every Sunday in case their song came on by chance, and once or twice it did. And Roy sat alone in his kitchen and did not dance, because you cannot dance alone. But he closed his eyes and let the song play and remembered the feeling of her wet, soapy hands on his shoulders. And it was the closest thing to joy and the closest thing to unbearable that he knew. It is worth saying what that house had been in its loud years, so you understand what the silence took away. For most of those 50 years, the house on Sycamore Lane had not held 2 people, but 4, and then more. Helen and Roy had raised 2 children in it, Nora and her brother Danny, and a house with children in it is never quiet. It is a riot of sound from morning to night, homework and arguments and the television and friends tramping through and doors and music and the endless negotiations of a family living close together. Helen had presided over all of it, like a conductor over an orchestra, adding her own singing to the din, never once wishing it quieter. And even after the children grew and left, as children do, the house had stayed loud, because Helen stayed loud, because Helen would no more live in a silent house than she would live in a dark one. She kept the radio on and the windows open and the kettle going and her own voice moving through the rooms. And the house stayed alive right up until the morning it did not. Roy had lived his entire adult life inside the sound of his family and then inside the sound of his wife, and he had never once in 50 years had to learn how to live inside silence, until suddenly at 76, with no warning and no lessons, he had to learn it in a single morning. And he found that he could not, so he cheated. He kept the radio on. It was the only way he knew to keep the house sounding like the 50 years he had loved. His daughter Nora worried about him, the way loving daughters do. She lived 2 states away and called often and visited when she could, and each time she came, she noticed the radio, always on, always murmuring, and each time she thought about mentioning it, and each time she let it go, because it seemed harmless enough, and her father seemed to find comfort in it. And there were bigger things to worry about. Whether he was eating, whether he was lonely, whether he should still be living alone in that big empty house at his age. But on this visit, this warm summer visit, sitting with him at the kitchen table in the evening, with the radio playing low the way it always did, something made her ask. Maybe it was the way he glanced at the radio when it crackled, as though checking on it, the way you check on a sleeping child. Maybe it was just that the time was right. She said gently, "Dad, the radio, you keep it on all the time now. Every time I come, it's on. Even at night, I hear it. I wondered why. Is everything all right? If you were still with me in the warm and the quiet, stay close." This is the part he had never told anyone. Roy was quiet for a long while. The radio played low between them. And then he told her. He told her about the morning her mother died, the thing he had never told anyone, not the doctors, not the neighbors, not Nora herself in 3 years of phone calls. He told her how he had known, before he knew anything else because the house was quiet. He told her that in 50 years the house had never been quiet because her mother had never let it be, because Helen had filled every room with singing and talking and the warm noise of a life, and that he had not understood until that morning that the sound of her was the thing he loved most in all the world. And he told her that the silence after, the silence of the house without Helen in it, was the worst thing he had ever heard. Worse than crying, worse than the funeral, that the silence was the sound of her being gone, and that he could not live inside it. And so he kept the radio on every hour of every day, not because he wanted to hear it, but because he could not bear to hear nothing, because nothing sounded like the end of the world. "It's not the radio, love," he said, and his voice broke a little, an old man's voice, breaking over the thing he'd carried alone for 3 years. "I don't even hear it most days. It's just, this house was never quiet, not for 50 years. She wouldn't let it be, and when she went, the quiet came in, and it was the worst sound I ever heard because it was the sound of her not being here. So I keep it on, so the house still sounds like a place where somebody lives, so I can come down in the morning and not walk into the quiet. That's all it is. It's a foolish old man keeping the radio on so his house doesn't sound dead." Nora did not say anything for a moment. The radio played, low and warm, some old song from before she was born. And then she got up from her chair and she came around the table and she put her arms around her father, this man who had carried his grief so quietly that even his own daughter had thought it was just a fondness for background noise. And she understood all at once the enormous and unbearable and completely ordinary weight of what he had been living with. That every morning for 3 years he had come down alone into the kitchen where his wife used to sing and had turned to a radio full of strangers rather than face the silence where her voice used to be. That the running murmur she had half noticed and nearly commented on was the sound of her father holding himself together, one broadcast hour at a time. He told her too about the night the power went out. It had been the winter of the second year, a storm, the lines down all over the county, and Roy had woken at 2 a.m. to a silence so total and so sudden that for one horrible, disoriented moment, he was back in that first Tuesday, waking to the quiet that meant Helen was gone. The radio was dead, the whole house was dead, dark and silent, the way it had been the morning she died. And Roy had lain there in the black and the quiet, an old man alone in a storm, and he had not been able to breathe because the silence had come back in and filled the house and pressed on his chest and told him again, "She is not here, she is not here." And there was nothing to hold it off, no murmur, no voice, no music, nothing between him and the full weight of it. He had gotten up in the dark and found a battery radio in the garage, his hands shaking, and he had turned it on right there on the cold garage floor, just to hear a voice, any voice, and he had sat there until a sound steadied him. He had never told anyone about that night. He told Nora now, and she understood finally and completely that this was not an old man's harmless fondness for background noise. This was a man holding back an ocean with a transistor radio every hour of every day, and had been for 3 years, alone. "It's not foolish, Dad," she said into his shoulder. "It's not foolish at all." And then Nora did something that told Roy she had understood him completely. She did not tell him to turn the radio off. She did not tell him it was time to face the quiet, to move on, to let go, all the things that well-meaning people say to the grieving as though grief were a bad habit to be broken. Instead, she reached over to her own phone and she found a station and she turned it on, so that now there were two sounds in the kitchen, two small human murmurs filling the room. And she said, "Then let's not let it be quiet, not while I'm here. I'll bring the kids next month. You've never heard a house so loud as when they're in it, Dad. You'll be begging for the radio back." And Roy laughed, a real laugh, the first one in a long while. And the two of them sat in that kitchen full of gentle sound. And it was, for the first time in 3 years, not a lie he was telling himself, but the truth. The house was alive because there were two people in it who loved each other, filling it with sound. What Nora had not told her father, sitting there with her arms around him, was that she carried her own version of the same grief and her own guilt alongside it. She had lost her mother too, but she had done what the grown children of grieving parents so often do. She had folded her own sorrow away and turned all her attention to worrying about her father's, as though there were only room in the family for one griever at a time, and it had better be him. She had not let herself miss her mother, not properly, because she had been so busy being practical, being strong, being the daughter who called and checked and worried. And sitting in that kitchen, hearing her father say out loud the thing he had carried alone for 3 years, Nora felt her own held-back grief rise up at last, and she wept too, not only for him, but for herself, for the mother who had sung in this kitchen, for the loud, warm house of her own childhood that had gone as quiet as her father's heart. They cried together, the two of them, at the kitchen table, with the radio playing low. And it was the first time in 3 years that either of them had grieved Helen in the company of another person who had loved her. And that, too, was a kind of medicine. Grief shared in a warm kitchen is a different thing entirely from grief carried alone up a dark flight of stairs. There was one more thing, and Roy would treasure it for whatever years he had left. The Sunday after Nora went home, she did a thing she did not tell him about first. She called the old station. It was still there, still running its request hour after all these years. And she asked the warm-voiced host if he might play a certain song and dedicate it to a certain man on Sycamore Lane from his daughter and his grandchildren, with love. And that Sunday evening, Roy was sitting at the kitchen table, as he always was, half listening to the request hour, as he always did, when the host's warm voice said, "And here's one going out to Roy on Sycamore Lane. Your family wanted you to know the house is never really empty, and they'll see you soon. This one's for you and for Helen." And their song came on, the song they had danced to on the linoleum for 50 years of Sunday evenings. And Roy sat alone in his kitchen with the tears running down into his collar. And this time they were not only sad, because for the first time in 3 years the sound in his house was not a lie, he told himself, but a message sent to him on purpose by people who loved him, who knew now why he kept the radio on, and who wanted him to know he was not carrying the silence alone anymore. They came the next month, Nora and her husband and the 3 grandchildren, and Roy's house on Sycamore Lane was loud for a week, really loud, gloriously loud, loud with running feet and slammed screen doors and children shrieking in the yard, and the radio playing under all of it, unnoticed, unneeded for once, because the house was full of the real thing again. And when they left and the quiet threatened to come back in, Roy turned the radio up a little, and he found he did not mind it so much anymore. because now the sound in the house was not only a lie he told himself to survive. Now it was also a memory of the week the house had been full, and a promise that they would come again. The radio had changed without changing at all. It had been the sound of holding on alone. Now it was the sound of a family that was going to keep the house alive together. Roy still keeps the radio on. He always will, most likely for the rest of his life. But it means something different now, that someone knows why. That is the strange grace of it. The grief did not get smaller because he finally told his daughter, but it got lighter because he was no longer the only one carrying it. There is an enormous difference between grief you carry alone and grief that someone else knows the shape of. The first is a weight that slowly crushes you. The second is still a weight, but it is a weight two people are holding, and that, it turns out, a person can live with. A person can even, on a good day, with the grandchildren coming next week and the radio playing an old song Helen used to sing, be something close to happy. So if you are lying awake tonight in a house that is too quiet, if there is a silence in your own home that presses on your chest, a silence where a voice used to be, a person used to be, a whole life used to be, let Roy be a quiet word in your ear. There is no shame in the small things we do to survive the silence. The radio left on, the television murmuring in an empty room, the habit you keep for no reason you could explain to a sensible person. These are not foolishness. They are the heart doing what it must to get from one morning to the next. And if you are the daughter, the son, the friend, the neighbor of someone who keeps the radio on, do not tell them to turn it off. Ask them why, and then listen. And then, if you can, fill the house with a little more sound, a little more life, so that the one who is grieving does not have to hold back the silence all alone. Because the silence is real, and it is heavy, and no one should have to keep it out by themselves. If you take one thing from Roy's kitchen into your own dark tonight, let it be this. The people we lose do not only leave an empty chair, they leave an empty sound. The particular music of them being alive in the world, the humming and the footsteps and the voice calling from the next room, the small daily noise we never once thought to treasure because we could not imagine it ever stopping. And when it stops, the silence it leaves is not nothing. It is a real and heavy thing, and living inside it takes a kind of courage that no one ever gives you credit for. Because from the outside, it just looks like an old man who leaves the radio on. So be gentle with the ones who keep the radio on. Be gentle with yourself, if you are one of them. And if you can, find the person who will sit with you in the too quiet house and ask you why, and listen, and then help you fill it back up with sound, because that is what love does in the end. It does not tell you to face the silence alone. It comes and sits inside it with you, and slowly, gently, over the ordinary days, it teaches the house how to sound alive again. Roy sleeps now with the radio playing low down in the kitchen, drifting faintly up the stairs, and it is enough. The house is not quiet. The house has not been quiet in 50 years, and Roy intends to keep it that way for Helen, who could not bear a silent room and filled every one she ever entered with song. And you can let your own eyes close now, wherever you are, knowing that somewhere on Sycamore Lane, an old man is being carried gently through the night by the small murmur of a radio and the large love of a daughter who finally asked the right question. There is nothing left to be afraid of tonight. There is only the low, warm sound of a house that is still after everything, a place where love lives. Rest now. Let the quiet, if it comes, be a gentle one. Thank you for spending this hour with me. If this story kept you company tonight, subscribe, and I'll leave the light on for you next time. Rest well.